Welcome to the Flight Standards Special Federal Aviation Regulation briefing on the relief for certain persons and operations during the public health emergency concerning COVID-19. My name is Kevin Morris, and I'm an aviation safety inspector with the Flight Standards Division of the Federal Aviation Administration, and I'll be your host for today's briefing. Our agenda today starts with understanding what a Special Federal Aviation Regulation is, and then we'll get into the actual contents of SFAR number 118 and the relief it provides, including training, recent experience, testing and checking relief, the continued use of pilots and other crew members in support of essential operations, as well as persons and pilot schools who may be unable to meet duration and renewal requirements, and finally, air carrier and operator flights of temporary overflow aircraft to storage locations. So let's begin. For many of you, this may be the first time you've really paid attention or looked into the Special Federal Aviation Regulation. So we thought it'd be a good idea to start with understanding what an SFAR is and where you can find it. First and foremost, a Special Federal Aviation Regulation is a rule. It's not an exemption or an exception or waiver or deviation, etc. It's a rule. This particular SFAR rule amends various parts of the Federal Aviation Regulations. It's important to remember as well that regulations within these parts that were not modified or amended by this SFAR still apply. Also, the SFAR is temporary. SFAR number 118 ends on March 31st, 2021. However, much of the relief that's provided by this SFAR will end much sooner than March 31st, 2021. So it's important when you're looking at the SFAR at a particular regulation that you understand when that relief starts and when that relief is set to expire. You can find the complete SFAR regulatory text in a few different locations. It is available on the Federal Register at federalregister.gov. You may also find it on regulations.gov by searching for docket number FAA-2020-0446. But maybe more commonly, most of you are familiar with the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations, or ECFR, at ecfr.gov. If you do look for it in ecfr.gov, you'll find the complete regulatory text under Part 61. This is the only place you'll find the complete regulatory text for the Special Federal Aviation Regulation number 118 in the ECFR. It may be referenced in other portions of the rule and other parts. However, that cross-reference will bring you back to Part 61 here, where you can read the complete text of the SFAR. Finally, it's important to note as well that if relief is not specifically mentioned in the SFAR, no relief is provided for that regulation. It has to be mentioned in the SFAR in order for the FAA to be allowing relief. And with that, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, which is Sean Hayes. And Sean is the manager of the Airman Training and Certification Branch in Flight Standards. Welcome, Sean.
All right, thanks, Kevin. And thanks to everybody for attending. I'd just like to reiterate one thing that Kevin said. And throughout this briefing, if there is relief that is not mentioned, then there's no relief provided. It's very important to understand. We've been getting a lot of questions about that, and you can just do yourself a favor and answer your own question by realizing that. Also, at the end of the briefing, there will be a location where you can get a substantial document of frequently asked questions related to the SFAR, and that will give you some more information about each specific part and may answer your question for you. All right, we're going to go ahead and get into it. A lot of times we ask about these rules, well, do they apply to me? And here's an applicability statement that talks about who the SFAR applies to. And generally, that applies to persons who are unable to meet certain requirements between the beginning of March and the end of June of this year, 2020. It covers certain training, recency, testing, and checking requirements from various CFR parts, as you see listed on the screen. along with duration and renewal requirements in those additional parts and SFARs. So let's get into some of the specific relief, and we'll start with medical certificates. And this is from the requirement and the duration. It applies to all pilots and operations. So this relief is afforded to everyone and extends your medical if it expired in March to May of this year. And it will extend that to June 30th of 2020. I want to make sure that you realize what it doesn't extend are the requirements of 6153, the prohibition on operations during medical deficiency. Those are still applicable. So if, God forbid, you have something happen, you have a cardiac event or, knee surgery or something along those lines, if you know that that's a grounding condition in accordance with 61.53, this relief is not applicable. So just keep that in mind. Action required by the pilot to use that relief is none. You don't have to provide any paperwork, file any forms, anything like that with the FAA. If you are going to use, if you're going to take a practical test, you just need to be aware of IACRA is not coded to accept expired medical certificates. So you and the designee are going to have to use a good old-fashioned paper 8710. I know how much everybody loves doing that. So brush up those pencils and get your skills sharp on doing that. All right, still sticking with the medical requirements for you flight engineers out there. Same relief, same requirements as the pilots. If anything expires, if your medical certificate expires between March 31st and May 31st, then you're afforded an extension to June 30th. Much like 6153, there's a rule in Part 63, 63.19, that talks about those same prohibitions during physical deficiency. So again, knee surgery, if you're prescribed a new medication, you're required to go check with your AME before you exercise the privileges of that medical certificate. Much like the pilots, the flight engineer doesn't require any action in order to use that relief. All right, we've been getting a lot of questions about prerequisites for practical tests, specifically airman knowledge tests that are expiring. And right now, if your knowledge test expires between March 20th and June 20th, then those knowledge tests are extended for 3 calendar months for the purpose of taking a practical test. No other reason, only for the purpose of taking a practical test. That does not extend the validity period for certificates issued without a practical test. In other words, ground instructor certificates, MILCOMP qualifications, Canadian conversions through an IPL process. So be aware of that. And for you designees in the audience, be aware that you cannot accept an expired knowledge test for those. A lot like the medical, IACRA is not set up for that, so it will not accept an expired knowledge test. So you're going to have to process that paper application again. And much like the medical, no action required from the airman to use it. No form to fill out, no declaration to be made. Okay, same thing with the flight engineer knowledge tests. Again, same requirements. If they expire between March 2020 and June 2020, you're afforded that extra 3 calendar months. And dispatchers, for the dispatchers in the crowd, again, those knowledge tests expiring between the end of March and the end of June, 3 calendar month extension, no action required by the dispatcher to use this relief. So across the three items, the dispatcher, the flight engineer, and the pilot, a standard 3-month relief with no action required and paper applications in order to get that certificate or rating. All right, you flight instructors out there are probably asking, Well, what about me? My flight instructor certificate is about to about to expire. And I put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into getting that, and I don't want to lose it. So for those flight instructors out there whose certificates expire between March and June, they can renew by meeting one of the requirements that are already in the CFRs. And those are listed, of course, under 61.197, A2 little I through Roman numeral 4. So your standard activity, FERC, a new certificate or rating, those will renew your flight instructor certificate through. Okay, when you do that, you're going to maintain your original expiration month. So if you expire in March, but you renew in June with the new required criteria, you are still going to have that original March expiration month. So your next renewal period may be less than 24 calendar months. You need to be very careful that you keep that date in mind. And again, no additional flight instructor action is required other than applying for the renewal. You cannot just go fly on an expired certificate. At the end, you have to apply for that renewal. Otherwise, it will expire and you'll be doing a reinstatement. Same thing with IACRA. Unfortunately, you can't use that for renewal. It has to be a paper application. Your designee that you're going to renew with can take care of you after that. And then the important piece to remember that after the end of June, if you hold an expired flight instructor certificate, you must reinstate, not renew. So remember to get those renewals done no later than the end of June. Again, we all work too hard and too long to get that flight instructor certificate, and that's one that we don't ever want to lose. We didn't forget about our military personnel out there. We provided some relief for SFAR 100-2, which used to give 6 calendar months after returning from a deployment in support of the armed forces overseas. You could use a expired knowledge test, or you could renew an expired flight instructor certificate. Well, we extended that for an additional 3 calendar months. So now you can apply up to 9 calendar months after your return from overseas. Alrighty, a lot of 141 schools out there that are affected by the COVID outbreak, and we've provided some relief to them. 141.5, provisional pilot schools who expire in April through June of 2020, they now have until the end of December of 2020 to meet the 141.5 Delta and Echo. And of course, 141.5 Delta is the quality of training. In other words, that 80% first time pass rate. And Echo is a quantity of training for those 10 different students. We realized that because of COVID, a lot of schools are closed, and they may not be able to work those 10 different students through there. So that's the reason for the relief. 141.5, the requirements, the conditions that must be met is you have to notify your responsible flight standards office that you're going to apply for the flight school certificate, so they know that you're not just going to let it expire. And then submit an acceptable plan explaining how you're going to meet both the quality and quantity of training to your assigned POI. Okay, for 141.27, renewal of pilot school certificates. Again, if you have an expiration between the end of April and the end of June, you're extended until the end of the year. So the same December 31st deadline. and that's subject to certain conditions, which are on this slide. Almost the same as for a provisional school. You have to notify that responsible office that you wish to renew and submit that acceptable plan, explaining the method to regain the currency for each instructor. That's very important, not just for the chief or for the assistant chief, but for each instructor, and evaluating students for the proper stage of training. And if under a special curricula, then any additional training. So much like the provisional, just instructor based. Okay, a lot of folks have been asking about, about UAS knowledge recency. For the remote pilots out there, we've looked at that and provided relief for you also. As you know, you're required every 24 calendar months. If you do not hold a Part 61 certificate and you do not have a current flight review, you're required to take a knowledge test. Well, that could be problematic with some, if not a vast majority of the knowledge testing centers across the country closed. So the relief we've provided is you may take an online training course, not a test, but a training course. And that'll provide you a one-time additional 6 calendar month of recency. Those courses are available free of charge on FAAsafety.gov. Again, that's FAAsafety.gov. The only thing you have to do is set up a profile with them, which I highly encourage. Anyway, there's a lot of great information on the site. And you can go in there and take that free course. And once you do, then you have another 6 calendar months of recency to use. After that 6 calendar months, then you're going to have to make your way to a testing center in order to continue exercising the privileges of that remote pilot certificate. All right, so we're going to move into a section of the SFAR here that we need to pay a little more attention to regarding the applicability. So moving on, this is something that's going to be applicable only to a select group of people. And we need to make sure that we put that up there. And I'm going to leave the slide up there just a little bit longer so that you can read it. But these following sections are for recency, testing, and checking requirements that only apply. Again, these only apply to operations for compensation or hire under Parts 91, 125, 133, and 137 if you hold at least a commercial pilot certificate. And then operations by persons who are exercising the privileges of a private pilot certificate, provided they meet the following requirements. So again, comp or hire, at least a commercial pilot certificate or a private pilot certificate, still for comp or hire, if you meet the following requirements. You're conducting a charitable medical flight for a volunteer pilot organization as part of an already approved exemption, or you're conducting a private aircraft agricultural operating, or you have a private aircraft a private agricultural aircraft operating certificate. Those people know who they are already, so I'm not going to get into those specifically. So just to reiterate, that private pilot has to meet one of those two requirements, or you notice the little word at the end there, or have at least 500 hours total time as a pilot. So not category specific. You can split that across gliders, helicopters, balloons, whatever. 500 total time as a pilot. Has to be 400 hours of PIC and at least 50 hours of flight time within the preceding 12 calendar months, and be doing it for compensation or hire. And as a reminder, under Part 61, that's flight incidental to that person's business or employment, in support of family medical needs, or to transport essential goods for personal use, necessary to fly an aircraft to a location in order to meet a requirement of Chapter 1, and a flight to transport essential goods and medical supplies to support public health needs. So make sure that you read that SFAR good as far as the applicability piece as we get into the following sections. So for second in command qualification, if you're out there operating as SIC, you know that you have a grace month after the month of your check that's due. We're giving you an additional 2 grace months to meet those requirements for a total of 3. Only if your base month falls between March and the end of June of 2020. And in order to be eligible, what you have to do as a pilot is review the information for the specific type of aircraft where you're seeking those SIC privileges. So if it's more than one, you have more than one review to do. And you have to log 3 takeoff and landings to a full stop as the sole manipulator of the controls while serving as an SIC within the previous 180 days. Alrighty, for folks out there wanting flight review relief, we've got something for you also. And we want to make sure that these are active pilots that are out there. We're not gonna allow somebody whose flight review is expired to go and operate. And we're not going to allow pilots that don't have a lot of activity to go out there and operate. And this is to ensure the safety of the national airspace system. So in order to be eligible for this relief, you have to have logged at least 10 hours of PIC time within the 12 calendar months preceding the month the flight review was due. So if your flight review is due in May, then between April of 19 and April of 2020, I have to have logged that 10 hours, and this is the key, of PIC time. SIC does not apply. The other requirement to be eligible is go on FAAsafety.gov and complete online courses totaling at least 3 wings credits. And as long as you complete these courses between January 2020 or later, it'll meet the requirements of that. Okay, on to recent flight experience. A lot of people have been asking about that. And the only relief that we've granted has been to instrument experience. Day or night takeoff and landings, tailwheel takeoff and landings, none of that has been afforded any relief, only to instrument currency. So if you remember, I always refer to it as the 6 and 6 rule. I have to do 6 instrument approaches within the preceding 6 calendar months. And then, of course, holding and navigation or tracking of a nav aid. To boil this all down, we've extended that 6 calendar month by an additional 3 calendar months. So instead of 6 and 6, we're doing 6 and 9. All right, so you do a 9-month look back, and provided you've got those 6 instrument approaches, navigation and holding logged, then you're authorized this relief. But again, to ensure that we have active pilots out there that are exercising this relief, we've put a little restriction on them. And you've got to be able to look back within the preceding 6 calendar months and find 3 instrument approaches, either in actual weather conditions or under simulated conditions using that view limiting device, of course, with a safety pilot. And so if you can't do that, then you cannot exercise the relief of this. So we've got the 6 and 9 in order to be able to exercise the relief. But even to be eligible, we have to be able to look back at any 6 months and see 3 instrument approaches in there. So just a little piece of safety in there to help try to maintain as much proficiency as we can in the national airspace system. And then you can exercise that relief through June 30th of this year. And then after June 30th, so beginning in July, you have to be current in accordance with 6157 Charlie In other words, back to the 6 and 6, or you have to reestablish currency by an instrument proficiency check. Okay, we have a lot of folks out there flying aircraft that require more than one pilot flight crew member or is turbojet-powered. And we've given some relief to you since these are typically done at a 142 training center, and a lot of those training centers are shut down right now. So pilots operating these aircraft, they know that they have a grace month after the base month, and we've extended that by an additional 2 grace months. Keep in mind that if you, the last bullet there says if you've done it in the grace period, you'll be considered to have completed in the base month. So in other words, your base month will not change, will not reset. So a lot like the flight instructor certificate, where you may have less than your 24 calendar months to your next renewal, in this case, you may have less than either 12 months or 24 months, depending on which form of the check you're doing, before your next pilot and command proficiency check is required. A couple actions the pilot has to do in order to exercise this relief. And you've got to meet the recent flight experience requirements as applicable to a flight being required, conducted. So in other words, you've got to be takeoff and landing current, light current, tailwheel current, so on. You have to reviewed within the previous 3 calendar months preceding the month of the flight. So this means there's a sliding window. I'm going to go out and fly today. I look back 3 months, and have I reviewed the topics on this slide? Yes, I have, within the last 3 months. Now I'm going to go fly next month. Have I reviewed those in the previous 3 months of the month of that flight? Well, no, it's only been 2 months. Or I'm sorry, it's been 4 months. Well, guess what? I'm no longer afforded the relief of this until I review those topics. So keep that in mind. That's a little nuance in that portion of the rule. Got some folks out there operating MU-2 Bravo aircraft, which of course is covered under Part 91, Subpart N. And these people have to be qualified already, and their base month for completing recurrent training falls in between the end of March to the end of June. So there's no relief if you currently are not flying MU-2s and you had started training to comply with Subpart N. There's no relief applicable to you. This is only for people that are required recurrent training. And if you complete that recurrent in the grace month provided, then the requirements are considered to be met in your base month, so same as before. And we are going to extend that by 2 calendar months. So some red text on there. There's a lot of requirements in this SFAR, too many to mention and still stay on time. So make sure that you pick up a copy of that. Kevin told you where you could find that early on in the presentation. Again, eCFRs has it under the Part 61 section, should be right up near the top. And make sure you familiarize yourself with those requirements. If you still have questions, those MU-2 folks are required training to be done at an approved training provider. You can always contact them and they can walk you through the process. So another aircraft that's covered by special training requirements are the Robinson R-22 and R-44 helicopters. This relief provides at R-22 or R-44 PIC some relief provided they're already compliant with SFAR 73. In other words, the awareness training, the PIC endorsement that's required for the folks out there, and so on. The relief is limited to pilots with at least 200 hours in helicopters. 50 hours of them has to be in the applicable Robinson model. So we can't use R22 time toward R44 or R44 time toward R22. And you have to have PIC privileges. So you've got to have that PIC endorsement in your logbook. Okay, if you're required to complete that flight review every 12 calendar months, then we will extend that for 3 calendar months, provided that flight review was due between the end of March and the end of June, if you meet the following criteria. Okay, you've had to have logged 10 hours of PIC in the applicable model within the last 12 months. Have 3 of the 10 hours in the 3 calendar months preceding in which the flight review is due. So again, here's that sliding window that I need to be able to look back any 3 calendar months and find 3 of those hours. So if I flew 8 hours one day and that was 4 calendar months ago, then I could not count that time. And you have to complete a minimum of 3 hours of self-study since January 1st of this year prior to conducting the flight. And there are some self-study subjects that are specifically addressed in the SFAR. So go there, make sure that you familiarize yourself with them, and just make sure that you're compliant. So Kevin, I've been talking for enough. I'm going to turn it over to you and take a little break. And thanks for the opportunity.
All right. Thank you, Sean. That was a lot of really good information. And like Sean has mentioned, folks, it's really important that if you're going to utilize the relief offered by this SFAR, that you do go in and read the text and become very familiar with the portions of the SFAR that apply to you, so that you understand exactly what's going to be allowed and what that allowance time frame is going to look like. Also, as Sean mentioned, at the end of our briefing today, we will have a website address available. We'll leave that screen up for a little bit so that you folks can copy that address down, where you can go for some additional information on the FAA and our COVID-19 response. So thank you very much, Sean. Our next presenter is John Atterbury. John is an aviation safety inspector in the Commercial Operations branch of the Flight Standards Division. And John, take it away.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Sean. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Atterbury from the Commercial Operations Branch. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the SFAR for Part 125 and Subpart 91K. And I want to remind everyone that this relief is for recurrent requirements only. It's not for initial certification or for requalification. For Part 125, the relief applies to both certificate holders and A125 letter of deviation holders. And the relief is for an additional 60 days for recency. That is, it increases the time frame for a pilot to perform 3 takeoffs and landings in type from 90 days and extends it out to 150 days. And it also adds 2 additional grace months for testing and checking, for a total of 3 grace months, but the base month always remains the same. Now, to obtain this relief, the Part 125 certificate holder or the A125 deviation holder must submit an acceptable safety mitigation plan to their principal operations inspector. The POI must then review and accept the plan, and that's based on their knowledge of the operator. And so that brings up the question, what should this safety mitigation plan look like? Well, the specifics of the plan are left up to each operator's judgment, and that's based on their particular operation. First, if the operator has a safety management system program, then they should mitigate the risk using their SMS program. Otherwise, the operator could mitigate the risk in a variety of different ways. For example, they might choose to increase look-back currency requirements, or they might require their crews to perform online training or testing. Regardless, the FAA is not going to dictate how the operator should mitigate the risk, only that the safety mitigation plan be acceptable to the principal operations inspector. Now, for fractional ownership under Subpart 91K, It's a very similar relief to that under 125. It adds 2 additional grace months to testing, checking, or training requirements. And this relief applies to pilots, flight attendants, check pilots, and flight instructors. An example of the grace month extension is that if a pilot is due a check ride in May, the normal grace months will allow that check to occur in June. But under the SFAR, the check is now not due until the end of August. However, the base month still remains May. And similar to Part 125, to obtain this relief, the management specification holder must submit an acceptable safety mitigation plan to their principal operations inspector. The inspector must then review and accept the plan based on their knowledge of the management specification holder. And again, plan development is up to each operator's judgment, tailored to their particular operation. And that's all I have for parts 125 and subpart K. If you have any questions, please visit the COVID-19 website at the end of this presentation for additional information or contact your principal operations inspector. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, John. And I think you bring up a pretty good point during your briefing there, that while a lot of the SFAR relief provided in SFAR 118 does not require any additional action on the pilot or airman or operator, there are certain portions that definitely do. So once again, it's a really good idea, folks, to read through that SFAR, have a very good understanding of what the requirements are and how the relief is going to work. So thank you very much, John. Our final presenter today is Kevin Morgan. Kevin is the manager of the Aircraft Maintenance and General Aviation branch in the Flight Standards Division. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kevin. What we'll do, we'll go ahead and start off by speaking on the Part 65 applicant. Just waiting for the slide to advance here. There we go. So this particular SFAR do have some relief structured within the SFAR for applicants who are applying for their mechanic certificate for the first time. These applicants have a 24-month window after they begin their testing cycle. They have a 24-month time period to get their testing completed. So what we have done, we have extended that 24-month window for an additional 3 months for these mechanic applicants to complete their testing. So overall, these applicants have a total of 27 months to get their testing completed. And this is done because of the COVID-19 outbreak. That virus have really restricted a lot of operators from going through the process of delivering the testing and making the testing available for a lot of the mechanic applicants, either coming out of a Part 147 school or just simply testing on a Part 65. So again, this SFAR do provide an additional 3 months for those applicants to complete their testing. So basically from March 2020 to June 2020, June is where the window for this SFAR for those mechanic applicants will be closed. Next, we'll look at what the relief that's provided for Part 65 inspection authorization holders, commonly called IA holders. Those IAs have an additional 3 months to complete their first year renewal requirements. So for an IA holder, there's a 2-year window in which those folks have to meet their renewal requirements. So their renewal requirements extend in year 1. They have a series of items that they need to meet. And year 2, there are additional items that they should meet for that year also. So this particular relief provided under the SFAR only applies to year 1 for the IA applicant. So therefore, under year 1, the applicant is granted 3 additional months to meet that first year requirement. So none of the windows will change for the renewal period in the second year. So this SFAR does not extend to the second year. This is only for the first year renewal requirements for the IA holder. Additionally, we have provided relief under this SFAR for military parachute riggers. These are folks who are applying for their senior parachute rigger certificate. These folks are coming out of the military. or still members of the military have an additional 3 months added to their 12-month requirement after being discharged honorably from the military, or if they're a civilian employee of the military, and that's both foreign and domestic military service members and civilian employees of the armed forces. So they have an additional 3 months to meet this requirement. And the window opens March 2019 this year, March 2020, all the way through to June 2020. So the additional 3 months is from March through June. Last, we are going to look at the authorizations extended under the SFAR to applicants who have aircraft that they're trying to relocate to storage. This is particularly applies to operators who own aircraft and that are subjected, to Part 119, Subpart K, and also 91K operators. So this particular SFAR under 21-197, the authorizations granted for these operators are to relocate their aircraft, to a storage location without going back to their FAA office asking for additional authorization. So no action is required going back to the FAA for these particular folks to actually exercise the privileges granted by this SFAR. So therefore, once again, it's relocating the aircraft using the special flight permit authorization on the 21-197 to get their aircraft over to a storage location. This particular authorization granted under the SFAR expires December 31st, 2020. So at the end of this calendar year, this SFAR authorization for the movement of aircraft to storage will expire. So again, you utilize operation specification D084 with the non-standard text area to complete this request and move forward. And this documentation should remain with the operator and a copy sent to the FAA office. Kevin, that's it for me.
All right, thanks so much, Kevin. And that last slide is a great example of where the relief that is provided through some of the SFAR will expire before the SFAR itself expires. So a great spot to once again promote taking a look at the SFAR, making sure you read through the portions of the SFAR that are providing relief for the segments of the rules that you're very interested in. So thanks again, Kevin. Well, everyone, that brings us to the end of our briefing today. The website on this slide is where you can find the additional information that we promised you early on in the briefing. So I'd like to thank you for watching this briefing today. And on behalf of the presenters and flight standards, please stay healthy and fly safe.